I know it's going to be a little difficult to keep you awake after the heavy lunch. I will try to keep it as entertaining as possible. Before we start, I just want to remind those of you who need to complete the form to get the grant that you need to stay until 3:30, right, at least. But don't leave at 3:30 sharp, please. As you can see, we have a very distinguished panelists, so we'll try to keep you entertained as much as we can. Okay, it's a slide. Okay, today we talk about how to achieve an effective charity board. This morning we've actually heard quite a bit on that already. There was a discussion on the new quote, why it's important to comply with the new quote, and we talk about the board renewal processes. We talk about the conflict of interest, and we also talk about talent recruitment and retention. So those are quite a number of things. So as you can see, there is a lot of responsibility for a charity board. When we went to school, when we were younger, they never teach us how to be a good directors, right? But they teach us how to count the red and the black and the yellow, how many of them. As you can see, there are quite a number of them, and some of that were addressed, of course, this morning. And even the quote itself, there are 9 areas and 72 guidelines, so it's quite a handful. And to make it easier for our board, the Charity Council also come up with checklists to remind you how to be an effective board. So there are a lot of responsibilities. And the subject of effective board, if you Google like I did, you'll find that in fact there's been many articles written about it by governance specialists, experts, by academics, by different professional institutions and whatnot. And in fact, you'll find that even some of the title of the articles are the same. Right? Some offer you the best 10 tips, some the best 3, some best 5, some best 6, whatever, right? So there are many advices on how to achieve effective board, whether it's a for-profit board or not-for-profit boards. And like I said this morning, we heard about the importance of the quote and the board renewal, conflict of interest and talents and all that. And of course, if you have been to a lot of the corporate governance, the forums or conferences the last few years, you'll see that one of the hot topics was about board diversity, right? Obviously, it's an important topic. Many people have written about it, and particularly for articles written a lot by headhunters, right, for obvious reason. They want you to recruit board members, but for charity, you don't have to go any further than CNPR, right? Winifred will be able to help you recruit new board members. But it is a problem for charity board. For example, I have one charity who say that, Sovann, I have a lot of taukees who contribute 1 million to me each year, and they're all on my board. But the problem I have is they never come, they're too busy to attend board meetings. So I'm sure a lot of you will like to have this kind of a problem, right? It's a good problem. So you need to diversify your board members, bring in professionals to sit on those governance committees and all that. Of course, the other hot topic in the last few years is also about gender diversity, right? And we can see on the charts there, for listed companies, there's been some slow but some progressions, improvements from 9% to about 10%. But according to the survey, which is recently released by CNPL, actually we're doing quite well in the charity sector. We have about 30 plus female directors. I think the reason is that a lot of the bigger law firms and accounting firms and banks and multinational companies and GLC companies, they have a policy of not allowing their female directors to sit on for-profit board, whereas they are able to sit on non-profit board to contribute. So that's why you find there's a large proportion of representation of female on charity boards, which is a good sign. And of course, with the new rule in the refined quote about the 10-year rule, which also created, I'm sure some of you, or most of you are actually trying to deal with this issue of the 10 years, how do I create board renewal with the 10-year rule. And of course, there's a perennial problem of the, I wouldn't say a problem, it's not a problem because if you ask the board, it's the ED's problem. If you ask the ED, it's the board's problem, right? of this issue of the dynamics between the ED and the chairman, which we will address later on as well because we have chairmans, we have EDs on the panel. And if you can look at this one, of course, in terms of the ED and the board dynamic, can see that the board member is a little worried, a little warm up. He's got some concerns. And whereas the ED, everything is gray, right? And when we looked at the board and ED dynamics, the tool that is commonly used is this 4-quadrant matrix. And of course, on the left bottom column, it's gray, right? Because it's gray, there's a yellow line which is invisible between what is the role of the board and what is the role of the ED. And usually happens in a case where there's a transition from a smaller charity. When you become bigger, you hire a full-time executive and they're not sure the role. And on the right-hand side, of course, just to explain as well that the horizontal axis is about the board's influence and the vertical axis is about the ED's influence. And in the yellow box, you can see that this is a case where the board is very dominant, everything is very directive, where the ED become subservient. And of course, we have seen on the red quadrant, I think a lot of the so-called scandals or that has been reported in the paper is because of the dominant founder or CEO. And obviously, the one that we want to move towards is the top right quadrant, the green quadrant, where there is a clear responsibility being defined between the role of the board and the ED, and there's trust and respect involved. So we can discuss that a bit more in the panel. And of course, what is an effective board also depends on who you ask. And we had this award in Singapore on the best managed board, and every year they interview the winners and typically the chairmen of what they think is the key elements of an effective board, and I've summarized them, and you can see that the percentage is, the top 5 is quite as expected, right? It's about board dynamic, compositions, and risk management and all that. So it's quite, I think, as expected. But somehow you can see that sustainability and talent retention is a bit low. But if you ask the independent directors, because I do quite a bit of training for independent directors of listed company, and you can see that the top 3 or 4 for them is basically compliance, right? They're not too concerned about the earning and the growth of the company, which is quite typical of Singapore, right? We all kia su, kia si, kia bo, kia cheng fu, right? So reflect the culture, right? Independent directors, please don't have scandals, you know. And then, okay, so the new quote, the refined quote for the charity has just been released in April. Looking forward, in my view, where are the areas that we can perhaps look at to improve governance? I have 2 or 3 areas to suggest. One is the concept of a lead director. Now, I actually bounced off a few people before this session. Some reservations there, I can understand. In the left, the blue section, you can see the rule for the listed company. The listed company basically say that if your chairman is related to the CEO, or chairman is the CEO, in fact, or somehow he's basically the 4 ABCDs is to say that if your chairman is not independent, you should appoint from your independent directors, you should appoint one of them as a lead independent directors to address certain shareholder concerns and to actually meet regularly and provide feedback to the chairman. And in the case of Singtel, if you look at the annual report, they actually went one step further than the requirement. They actually had the lead independent director, who is also the chairman of the nominating committee, to actually evaluate the chairman's performance. Yeah, so they've actually gone beyond the quote. So how do we apply that to the charity and try to see if we can improve governance in the charity? In the charity, unless you are a religious organization where usually chairman and the CEO could be the same person, but most of the charity, I think, chairman and CEO are separated already. But the chairman or the president is a key office bearer. And there's also this gray area whether office bearer is independent or not independent. And if you have in my view, if you have a lead director, or who usually is the chairman of the governance committee, if you have, or for smaller charities, any of the independent directors who are not office bearer to act as a lead director, I think it gives and this lead director and the chairman can work together to ensure that there's a proper culture at the board and the board process, transparency, and all that. I think it would improve the governance of charity. So I think it's a concept that is worth exploring. The others point I want to bring up is the concept of independence. I think a lot of you are actually having a bit of trouble trying to look at the board renewal process, because the 10-year rule applies to all directors on a charity. It doesn't matter whether you are an office bearer or you are a so-called independent. In the case of a listed company, it's quite clear, like David mentioned this morning. Where in the case of a listed company, either you are executive director, you get paid, or you are non-executive director, independent director, and you get paid a fee. You don't have executive responsibilities, you don't sign checks, and you don't make investment decisions, and or you do it as a board collectively, but you don't operate like a finance committee. So in the case of listed board, the role between executive director and non-executive director are quite clear. There's also a principle definition in the quote itself about what is independent, right? No relationship with the management that could impair or perceived to be impairing your independent judgments. Whereas if you look at the charity quote and the IPC regulations, the definition of independent is in the IPC regulation is more in relation to the founding organization or the founder of the IPC itself, whereas in a quote it talks about relationship with the paid staff, where the paid staff should be less than a third. I just realized last night there's a percentage missing in the bullet point there, 50%, right? And so I think this is an area that we can look at and try to refine what is an independent for a charity board, and maybe we can and then apply that 10-year rule a little different. I know for some charity, the so-called independent, truly independent directors have 5 or 6 years term limit, which is lower than the 10-year rule. Anyway, I just trying to stimulate some discussions. Nothing right, no right or wrong answers to see whether or not I think the definition of independent can be refined further. I looked around and the UK, there is no definition. Australia or Canada also don't have such definition. But in the US, independent, again, is also defined in relation to paid staff. So in the US, if you are the founder of the charity, you manage the charity, but you don't get paid, presumably your wife can also be independent, right? So the other thing that I want to bring up is a concern on a checklist. I think the feedback is that, or even through my experience as well, that I found that although you're required to submit an evaluation checklist, most of the time it's actually submitted by a clerk somewhere in a charity. The board didn't actually look at it and approve it, right? So how true is the declarations, you know? People seem to forget that if you look at the bottom of my slide, the board is responsible, right, for the accuracy of the declarations. But of course, you can always say that is form, you know. But to me, I think form provides the basis for the substance to grow, and if you have the form, if you don't even have the form, it's quite difficult for the substance to nourish, right? And of course, if you have the substance, the form is a lot easier. So what is, to me, in concluding, what is a true substance of a good governance, I think is the first box there, where you have respect and trust and candor amongst the board members, as well as the ED and the board. I think, to me, that is the most important one, and of course of course with the heightened attention by the regulators and stakeholders on compliance, the board tend to focus quite a bit on compliance as well. But I think beyond that, you need to come back to the core of the mission and the vision, what impact you are trying to generate as a charity, and you should also look at the sustainability as in your human capital, as in your financial resources. Those are the things that was also mentioned this morning. Okay, so that ends my short presentation.